We are going to, we're going to be recording this session of the World Trails monthly Trails Talks for others who can't make it today. And so yes, I'm going to hand over to Sam and enjoy.
Thank you, Galeo. And thanks to the World Trails Network for sponsoring this Trails Talk. To begin this session, I'm going to briefly frame the talk with some perspective on huts, and then introduce our featured speaker, Jeff Marion. And we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. So basically around the world, as you all know, there's a long tradition of walking, biking, and skiing on trails for days on end, and then spending the night along the way. Today, these forms of sort of personal pilgrimage are becoming even more popular as people are driven to connect with nature. And I'm particularly interested in where do you spend the night when you're on trail for days on end? While many of these trekkers are backpackers and they carry a tent and sleep in the tent, in many parts of the world, some parts of the world, huts are prevalent. And I define a hut as an enclosed structure. And there are also shelters on many trails, and those are open shelters. They're both built to provide some measure of protection from the elements and some measure of comfort on the journey. And there's a fascinating range of building types and levels of amenities and so on in huts, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. The huts are particularly concentrated in Europe, Scandinavia, New Zealand, and Japan. There are fewer huts in the United States, but they're rapidly becoming more important in the US and more popular, as is village to village trekking, which is an old European tradition and really an old world tradition. One important purpose of my study of huts is to inform a growing conversation in the United States about what roles huts can play here, and to inform it with the perspective and experience in part of other people from around the world. What can we learn from the experience of huts in other nations? Another key topic for me is thinking about the potential roles of huts beyond recreation. How can they be used as infrastructure for education, community building, environmental education in particular, therapy, spiritual development, and conservation? And one key aim of my work is to help ensure that in the US, huts become part of the solution, not part of the problem of degrading the lands we love. And they do that by supporting more, they can support more and more people staying overnight in the backcountry with less environmental impact. How can huts become a tool in the kit of land managers is one of the big questions that I have. I did a literature search when I started this research on the environmental impact of huts. And I talked to a lot of folks in the huts and trails community, and I was surprised that I could not find any empirical studies documenting the environmental impacts of staying in huts along the world's trails. I quickly learned that the common wisdom is that these are buildings that are designed to absorb human impacts. And of course, they do less harm than camping. Many huts and trails folks, in fact, said to me, basically, why bother to study something that's so obvious? But I persisted. I think we need evidence in certain circumstances to change minds about management practices. So I persisted in trying to find research that actually confirmed this common wisdom. And that's how I met Jeff, Dr. Jeff Marion. Over the years, Jeff has conducted recreation ecology studies on the impacts of various forms of camping and shelters, and immediately saw that studying the impacts of huts was a gap in the research literature. Along with Dr. Robert Manning, we wrote a grant proposal to the U.S. Forest Service to fund such a study, along with qualitative research about how people perceive the experience of staying in huts. Alas, it was not funded. But several years later, Jeff emailed me that he had found a perfect study site to compare different forms of backcountry overnight stays. This was in Canadian national and provincial parks. And they use a wide variety of overnight types in a roadless area. And then most importantly, they had accurate user data. So he went ahead with his graduate students and his scout troop and others to do this first ever study of the environmental impact of huts. By way of introduction, Dr. Marion is an avid outdoorsman. He grew up exploring nature in the outdoors. As an Eagle Scout, he taught backpacking and climbing skills for 5 years at a National Boy Scout camp in New Mexico. After studying biology in college, he got a master's and a PhD from the University of Minnesota. And his research was on developing methods of studying human impacts on soils, water, plants, and ecological communities in camping in the Boundary Waters Wilderness Canoe Area. Jeff has taught park management, worked as a research biologist for many years with the U.S. National Park Service and the U.S. Geological Survey, and has been stationed at Virginia Tech University, where he works with graduate students. Jeff was a founding member of the board of directors of Leave No Trace, and he guided the development of low impact principles and practices, and is the author of their official book, Leave No Trace in the Outdoors. He has more than 170 publications and has studied campsite and trail impacts on the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and in dozens of national parks. I could go on and on about his credentials and accomplishments, but I'll simply say that he's a really nice person, a dedicated environmentalist, and generous in sharing his research. We're lucky to have him with us here today. Jeff?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Can folks see that now? Can you see that, Sam?
Yes.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you for the introduction, Sam. It's my pleasure to be here today to do this World Trails Network Trails Talk. It's pretty exciting to share this study that we did. It's actually a very small sort of shoestring budget study that I did. My field assistants on this were high school students that were in my venture crew. This is a Boy Scout program. My crew is co-ed and actually predominantly female. So I had 3 young ladies assist me in this study, including one of them was a doctoral student working with me at Virginia Tech University, which is where I'm duty stationed. As you mentioned, I was originally National Park Service. They moved all of the scientists out of the NPS and into the U.S. Geological Survey, so I work for them now. But I'm stationed at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia. So the title of my talk today is Sustainable Overnight Visitation Options, and we're going to look at lodges, huts, and 2 different types of campsites. So I'll explain that in a few minutes. But let me go ahead and get started, and we'll be able to, to get into some questions at the end and some discussion. So my objectives today, first, is to simply describe the challenge of sustainably managing overnight visitation. And I use the word protected areas, and that can mean parks of any type, wilderness areas, national forests, and so on and so forth. Even wildlife refuges would be a protected area. I'm going to introduce to you recreation ecology science. It's an extremely small field of study. that looks at visitor use and impacts, and these are negative impacts to the natural resources and the environment in these protected natural areas. And then describe results from this very small study that we did. It's a small study, but it's a good one. And we will be writing a peer-reviewed journal paper and publishing it in one of the best journals. And so it's good science, but it was a very small study that I kind of threw together. I'll explain that a bit more in a minute. And then finally highlight, what did we learn from this study and what are the implications, and how does that inform sort of best management practices for protected natural areas in terms of how do you accommodate and sustain overnight visitation. So a description of recreation ecology, again, it's a very small field of study. There's probably less than 10 people in the world who would introduce themselves as a recreation ecologist. And most of them are in the United States. But we, as I mentioned, we look at these different kinds of impacts to vegetation, to soils, to water, to wildlife, and we measure them, monitor them. More importantly, we use that data to try to understand what are the factors that affect these impacts, what are the most influential factors, and how could managers manipulate those to accommodate increasing visitation with, in some cases, less impact. We've got lots of examples of where we've done studies and it's led to new approaches, new ways of managing the visitor use that have had less impact than before, even with increasing use. And so some people call this carrying capacity management. The new term is visitor use management. If you Google search, VUM or visitor use management, you'll find some new frameworks that have been developed in the United States on that interagency program that looked at that. It was actually led by a former doctoral student of mine, Carrie Cahill, who's with the National Park Service. And then finally, developing these best management practices that we can, sort of market and apply to in the future have more use with the same or less impact. So a lot of what we're doing now is tied to sustainability. So let's just simply define that in terms of camping management or overnight visitation management. And so a sustainable campsite can accommodate the intended type and amount of use over time without unacceptable levels of expansion, degradation, or maintenance. And generally, sort of a core, indicator of interest has been, what is the aggregate area of sort of intensive trampling and impact? And so it relates to the size of these, recreation sites and campsites and overnight sites. It's what is the footprint of intensive trampling disturbance to the environment? And so that's caught up with how many of these sites are there, and then how large are each of these sites. So it's the aggregate area of impact from overnight visitation that we're concerned with. And historically, in many areas, managers have just kind of let things go. And so sort of an unregulated overnight visitation where, visitors, you can camp wherever you want, maybe not next to streams, for example, but in general, it's pretty wide open, and we call that unregulated camping. And so we go out and we measure how many of these sites are there, where are they located, and then how large are they? And then we start, aggregating that to talk with managers. And we've, uncovered lots of real problems, significant problems. And in the last sort of 8 or so years, I've been doing some pretty big studies with my graduate students here at Virginia Tech and some other colleagues. On the Appalachian Trail, we did a 10% sample of the entire Appalachian Trail and studied both the trail conditions and the campsites. There's a big report on that that I'll refer to later. And then that led to a similar large study on the Pacific Crest Trail, which focused only on overnight visitation and sustainability of camping and things. And this is perhaps the worst place that we found on the Pacific Crest Trail. It's called Twin Lakes, and we now have a new term. We call it mega cluster, where we had a very large cluster of campsites and over 10,000 feet of camping disturbance. And then a similar place, this was way back in 2000 when I did some consulting work with the Appalachian Trail community, which predated the big study that we just did recently. But in this earlier study, we found a place here at Annapolis Rocks that the clubs that, basically considered to be the worst camping place on the entire Appalachian Trail. And here's just some of the, the data that we collected from that effort, which shows you when you have this unregulated camping, things can get real messy when you have very, very high use, intensive use. And the conditions are, essentially unacceptable. And here's from the very recent study that we did on the AT, some of our data summarized, again, a 10% representative sample. And we found that 28% of all campsites on the Appalachian Trail were larger than 1,000 square feet, which is a pretty large campsite. And a lot of the managers felt that that was, really, quite unacceptable. And so we do have these problems, not just on the long distance trails, but in other national parks and wilderness areas. And it sort of begs the question of, how have we done? And certainly when we have this unregulated camping, we're having some real problems. There's some unacceptable conditions out there. And so one of the questions I have is, are there other options, besides standard traditional campsites? And there are. And so that's what we're trying to analyze now in some of these newer studies. There's different kinds of tent sites, or campsites rather. Some have these constructed tent pads, and some campsites have been put in sloping terrain where you've heard of a side hill trail. Well, we're calling these side hill campsites, and I'll come back to that a little later and explain that further. But something like, close to 1,000 of these have been developed along the Appalachian Trail now, and they've been very successful. In this study, there was an opportunity. I have this co-ed venture crew of high school youth, and we take a big Western trip every year. And this year in 2019, we were headed up to do backpacking in Banff National Park up in Canada, and also Assiniboine Provincial Park, which is a little less known, but it's quite spectacular. And I had gone up there the year before with a few of the dads of some of the venture crew girls to sort of scope it out. And I was stunned at the fact that when we were hiking and backpacking through these two parks, I was encountering two different kinds of campsites, traditional sites, and then these tent pad campsites, which I'll show you in a minute. And then also huts and lodges, all in the backcountry, in what most people would define as wilderness. I mean, no roads anywhere near. And so I then discovered that even better, that they had perfect use data. And this is something that I've never discovered in 30 years of research with the U.S. Park Service and the Forest Service. We just don't have good use data in the United States. We never have. And so it's been a huge limitation in a lot of my different studies. But up here, they charge visitors on a per person basis to use all of these campsites and all of these huts and lodges. And so they have perfect use data. And we saw almost basically virtually no non-compliance. So that was the birth of this study. I reached out to both the parks. They gave me very limited funding, and I kind of did this on a shoestring budget. But so this is the study that I'm going to talk about today, and some of the really phenomenal findings related to huts. I mean, I was stunned, quite frankly. So the location of this was Alberta, Canada, in the Northern Rocky Mountains. Banff National Park, many people have heard of that. It's a huge park. It is accessible by cars in many places, and so it has enormous visitation, 4.12 million visitors per year, I think was in 2019. Assiniboine Provincial Park is BC parks, British Columbia parks, and they only have 40,000 visitors. They have essentially no roads within the park or up to the park. It's more of a kind of a backcountry park, and so only 40,000 visitor days per year in general. But spectacular scenery. So our objectives were to compare these 4 different kinds of overnight accommodation that I discovered when we did this hike in 2018 to prepare for my venture crew trip in 2019. And as I said, they have 4 types, and let's go ahead and look at those now. And so what you're going to see, let's start at the bottom right here, and you have the sort of traditional campsites where people just simply make a campsite, and generally they're less than 1,000 square feet in size, but it's sort of one unit or one area of exposed soil where people camp and they cook and they hang out and talk, and all on one site, and there's multiple sites. At Banff and Assiniboine, they have created these I'm going to call them tent pad campsites, where you can see in the top right picture here these tent pad campsites, but they're paired with, and the reason they've done this is that they're paired with separate areas where you go to eat and prepare your dinners and your food, and then store that food with the storage boxes that you see in the background, on this slide here. And so these are separate use areas, and they looked really quite small to me, and I felt like, oh, that's an improvement, even in flat terrain, that you can do this. And then there are also, the Assiniboine Lodge here, and the main lodge is this picture. And then here's one of their cabins. So you can either stay in the lodge in rooms there, or you can stay in one of their cabins. And they had 7 cabins. And then nearby, the Assiniboine Lodge has been contracted to run the hut system. And it's called the Nasset huts. And so there are 5 of these huts. And actually, this is the hut down here. The top picture here is a communal dining facility for people using the huts. They can go and cook dinner and hang out in this communal, somewhat larger building here. And so that's the huts, but there's no staff there. The difference is that there's staff here that take care of everything, cook you dinners and all that kind of thing. At the huts, there are no staff that do anything for you. They just check you in and check you out, and you're on your own other than that. And so this was an opportunity. If you look at the table at the top now, there were a number of campsites, 3 different camps or campgrounds, if you want to call them that, where there are campsites with tent pads here. And then there were 2 of these camps, or campgrounds that had traditional campsites without the tent pads. And then there's the Assiniboine Lodge, and then the Nasset huts. And so this is just some summary information, and then which park that they were within. I wanted to a little more thoroughly introduce these, the lodge and the huts for you. It was very interesting to me to discover that Assiniboine Lodge was North America's first backcountry ski lodge. It was built in 1928. And so there's rooms in the lodge, and then there's these 7 cabins. And I'll show you a picture of those next. And then there's the Nasset huts. And the 5 huts were built by the Alpine Club of Canada. There's a guy, A.O. Wheeler, who I guess either maybe built or operated those in the early days. But in 1925, so I guess I'm wondering, they didn't say on the website that this was like the first huts in North America, but they very well could have been. And so, they're owned by the BC Parks, British Columbia Parks, and they're operated by under contract by Assiniboine Lodge. And both of these facilities are sort of year-round use. They're both really remote. They're 26 kilometers from the nearest road. And they're in the sort of subalpine zone, and they're in insanely scenic areas, where Mount Assiniboine is right there, and Lake Magog is right there. So let's look a little bit at the research methods. I'll try to run through these fairly quickly, but as I mentioned, it was conducted in the summer of 2019. I had 2 of my venture crew youth helping me. These were high school students and a PhD student, one of mine from Virginia Tech University. Both Banff National Park and the Assiniboine Provincial Park did provide limited funding to us to sort of offset, probably the majority of our field expenses. All overnight sites and facilities in these 2 areas and all of the formal and informal trails that are directly associated with with the lodges or the huts or the campsites. We measured all of it and combined it all. And so in other words, if we had a small campground of campsites, we measured every campsite, we measured every area or spot of visitor use trampling, like where people ate, where people stored their food, even the restroom facilities. Like, if there was an outhouse, we collected probably a 10 by 10 foot, or a 3 by 3 meter polygon for the outhouse. And then the trails, we walked the trails and we used a sub-meter GPS unit, Tremble, to document all of these locations and to make maps of these sort of backcountry infrastructure and facilities, and ArcGIS essentially. The sizes of all these footprints of intensive trampling and disturbance and the structures themselves were collected and combined. We collected them separately, but we were able to combine them, obviously. And more importantly, again, I'm going to reemphasize this, never in 30 years of my career have I had use data that was anywhere close to being as comprehensive and as accurate as what we were able to get from Parks Canada and BC Parks. The US does not do a good job of collecting use data in protected natural areas. We do it in car campgrounds, but not in the backcountry. I bet you even in car campgrounds, we know how many nights a campsite was used, but we don't necessarily always know exactly how many people are on those campsites. In these parks, you're charged on a per person basis. And so they do collect and carefully track exactly how many people used the site. And so that was unprecedented. I've never had data like this. And so we got that data from the parks. They sent that to me electronically for the entire year of 2019. And we looked at other years to make sure that that was a typical year, and it was for the most part. And so I'm going to present some results today. These are preliminary results. We're working on a journal paper. We'll probably write that this winter, but we've done a lot of the analysis and generation of tables already. And so I felt confident that this was far enough along to present today. I created this presentation literally yesterday. But this table we've been working on for a few months, quite frankly. And so here's all the individual areas that we looked at. The first 2 here are the traditional campsites. The next 3 are these campsites that have tent pads with separate eating areas. And in fact, they did this predominantly for wildlife protection reasons. There's a lot of bears in this area. And these are grizzly bears. And so they want to have people camping in one place with their tents and eating and storing food in a completely separate, somewhat distant area for visitor safety. And so that was the reason that they did, these tent pad campsites and these separate eating areas. But it was an opportunity for us with superb use data to evaluate 2 different styles of campsites along with the lodge and the huts. And so that's what this study was, is we went out and measured everything very carefully with this sub-meter GPS unit and used cell phones to collect all of our data. Don't use paper and pencil anymore. And then here's all the results. And so here's sort of the number of sort of sites here. And these are kind of subtotals, so we can focus more on those for the campsites. And then here's the number of visitors that we got for these sites. And, you know, it's like, so this is one of the less used campsites, McBride Camp. Another one here, Howard Douglas Lake, was the smallest. But some of them were, you know, used quite heavily, like Magog Lake Camp, which is, you know, at the base of Mount Assiniboine, had 4,000 campers that year. And that was typical of most years. And so those are those numbers. And then you can look at the lodge had, you know, again, almost 4,000, nearly 4,000 folks. And so did the huts. You know, the huts were also very popular, had as many people as the lodge. And then we summed the total area of disturbance that we measured. And again, I'm going to emphasize that these sums include the aerial measures of disturbance, like where the tents go and where people ate and stored their food, but it also includes the informal and formal trails within those campsite areas. So if you had a cluster of campsites, and you had a number of formal, you know, designated trails, and then a few informal visitor-created trails, we measured it all. And we looked at the width of those trails, and we did the math, and we added those in. Okay, so this is a total comprehensive examination of impact. And then what we did is we looked at it on a per site basis. I just was curious to see how large are these campsites, and it turns out they're quite small. You know, 500 square feet of you know, impact for a campsite is a reasonably small campsite. 600, 400, 5, you know, these are all relatively small campsites according to US standards, and yet some of them are intensively used. And then we divided, you know, that by the number of people, by the visitor column, and you get this, the sort of square feet per person of impact. You know, so, you know, per overnight stay, what is the aerial measure of, you know, of impact to the environment? And that's, I would argue that that's the most important measure right there. If you're a manager trying to manage, you want to have as many people as you can with the smallest footprint of impact to your park or protected area. And so when we looked at that column of numbers, you know, look down at the bottom, you've probably already been there. But 0.85, that's for huts. And again, I was, you know, I expected it to be low. I didn't expect it to be anywhere near that low. I was stunned. And according to this, you know, huts are literally head and shoulders above any other form of overnight visitation for minimizing the aerial extent of trampling and you know, intensive impact to the environment. And so if I were a manager, I'd be looking into huts. And, you know, Sam hasn't paid me anything. I'm an independent, you know, scientist here. I'm just looking at the data. And so we will be publishing this in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm sort of targeting probably the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. But we haven't yet, you know, written that paper. We've got the data done, but these are the results. And, you know, it's interesting. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over these results. You know, it was fascinating to see that the worst was, you know, one of these traditional campsites. And that's what I, quite frankly, I expected it to be. But one of the best was also actually the best here in terms of square feet per person, other than huts, was Marvel Lake Camp. And when you look at Marvel Lake Camp, you realize, well, it's a campsite that's in a fair amount of topography. In other words, not a lot of flat ground. And that was why, you know, this site has a fair amount of topography, sloping terrain that focuses that, you know, that use on a small footprint campsite. And then Howard Douglas Lake and some of these others were kind of intermediate. These are the sites with those tent pads. But when you add in all these other areas of disturbance, like the place where you eat and the place where you store your food and the place where you've got, you know, toilet facilities, they had pit toilets. When you add all those in, it kind of came up closer to this level of these traditional campsites. And that was kind of surprising. I thought that these would be smaller, quite frankly, than they were. The lodge was pretty much where I thought it would be, pretty large, and I'll show you a picture in a minute that shows you why. And the huts was just the stunning finding that I knew it would be small. I had no idea it was going to be that small. And so let's look at some of these findings visually. Here's an aerial view. People fly in and out of these lodges and huts, those who don't hike in. They fly in and out on a helicopter. And so they've got a helicopter landing area. I think it's right here. And this is the main lodge, and this is some of the lodge rooms are in this building. And then these are all these other buildings you see here are for the lodge staff and support services, like a storage building and a workshop and things like that. And then if you follow this trail, you go to this picture, that's this trail here. And this is looking the other way, again, from kind of the air. And these are some of their cabins right here. I think there's 7, and you can see maybe only 5 of them here. But you go out this trail and you're going out to these cabins that the lodge, they're again part of the lodge. So the lodge is a really large complex, and that's why the total area of disturbance was so high, but still not bad. I mean, I've seen campsites that are worse than that. And then again, back to these tent pad campsites, which I thought would be small. The reason they weren't is that you added in all these other facilities here where you store your food and where you eat, and there's spillover impact. You can see that here. And so when we measured all of the stuff in the field, we measured the intended area of disturbance, which was this pad. But we also then added in and measured the visitor impact associated with that intended area. And that's this area outside the footprint of the facility, so to speak. And so for this facility, we allowed only, about 1 meter by 3 meters or 1 meter by 2 meters of intended impact, in addition to what's underneath this thing. And then all of this out here, we would have measured as visitor impact. Same thing with this post. We would have allowed a little bit of impact underneath it as a facility intended impact, and anything beyond that we said was sort of visitor impact. But the numbers you were looking at before was everything combined, aggregated together. And then let's look at the campsites again here. The traditional campsite, which is the single large campsite, versus these tent pads. And as you can see, if you compare these two, the tent pads are tiny, but once again, there's all those other facilities that we had to add in, which made them come back to close to this number. And so these tent pad campsites were good, but they weren't substantially better than these sites, unless these sites were in big flat areas. When these sites were in sloping terrain, they tended to be quite small, and they were better than this approach here. And that leads me back to this side hill campsite, and there weren't any side hill campsites in this study, but we've been exploring those in separate studies, particularly on the Appalachian Trail. I first discovered this concept when I did a study at Isle Royale National Park back years ago. I think it was maybe 2005 or so. And they didn't have a lot of flat terrain at Isle Royale, so they built these side hill sites that look like this one. And I realized that in a study, and I came back and highlighted and literally kind of marketed that concept in the Appalachian Trail community. And they've now built about 725 of these at last count. And they've been wildly successful. The volunteer, stewards, on the AT community has pretty much been putting these in all over the place. And they've been very successful in sort of, dramatically reducing the aerial extent of camping impact wherever they've been built. And in some cases, we've gone into large areas like Annapolis Rocks, I mentioned earlier, I'll come back to that, and solve the problems that we had there. And but the concept is fairly straightforward. Here's actually it's right here. We closed all of the campsites at Annapolis Rocks. back in 2000 and built these side hill sites. We built 14 of them. I think we closed 18 traditional campsites. And so the total area of disturbance was 43,000 square feet initially, and that was replaced by 3,400 square feet with these new side hill campsites. 92% reduction in the total area of impact. And so that was a pretty substantial success. Just a few more slides here. You can, put in some facilities that will help to attract and spatially concentrate camping activity. And so if you don't want to put in a steel fire grate, you can iceberg. These rocks are iceberged down into the ground so that just the tops of them protrude. And so it's a way to anchor this fire site and make it easy to clean out with this rock here. And then this is actually, a lot of people don't use campfires anymore. They're almost all using stoves these days, backpacking stoves. And so you put in a big flat rock and you set it up on top of some chunky rocks underneath, bigger the better. And people come in and pull out their stove and pots and say, gee, where should I cook dinner? And they all go to the same place here because they have a nice kitchen table, this rock here with a nice place to sit. And so if you make these things and anchor them, then people tend to be attracted to them and use them and thereby spatially concentrate those intensive camping activities in one place on each site. And that's the key is, everyone cooks and eats and or tents in the same places. And so you go to the tenting places and you make them perfect. If there's a stump sticking up, you take it out. If there's a depression, you fill it in. So you make a perfect tent pad. Actually, you should really make like 3 on each campsite. And then people will use them consistently. 99% of the people will use the same ones, and therefore this campsite stays small. So at any rate, that's just an example. I need to move on, but this overnight management toolbox has lots of different practices, sort of best management practices. Implementing a containment strategy. So this refers to these unregulated camping is a real problem. We're having some real impacts associated with that. So increasingly, we're going to various forms of containment where we either use established site camping, where we pick out the most sustainable sites and we put them on the maps, or we put them into the phone apps and people find and use them repeatedly, but it's not required. Or we go to designated site camping where it is required and we identify a smaller number of sustainable sites. And that's where we're headed now, is what makes a campsite sustainable? And how can we identify those and move people to them? And so selecting sustainable locations, constructing sustainable facilities, for example, those anchored fire sites or a stove cooking area or creating really good tent pads on each campsite that people will be attracted to and will use. So it's a matter of attraction to these facilities that we provide, and they're really justified on the basis of resource protection, not visitor convenience. These facilities are a powerful attractant that spatially concentrate the use, which result in smaller campsites, okay? And then maintaining all of this stuff. You build a perfect tent, pad, you've got to maintain it just like a trail. It's no different, really. Keep that tent pad smooth and well drained, and people will use it repeatedly forever. And then finally, education and regulation has a role. And so, going out to the visitors with the Leave No Trace program and providing them with good practices that are science-based that help them reduce their impact. And in some cases, if that doesn't work, resorting to regulations. We don't like to do that, but when we have, intensive management, when we have intensive use, you pretty much have to adopt an intensive management. And sometimes that involves regulations and their enforcement. I wanted to share this with you briefly. There's a paper out on this, but we did a lot of relational analyses, statistical testing and modeling using regression, for example. And these were the factors from the big, huge Appalachian Trail study that predicted the size of campsites the best. And so sloping topography The people, the realtors who sell homes, and they say it's all about location, location, location. Well, they aren't wrong with campsites either. When we found campsites that were in sloping topography, they were tiny and they were few in number. When we found campsites in big, huge flat areas near water at attraction locations, the sites were numerous. Site proliferation was a major problem, and site size expansion was a major problem. And that's where we had all of the unacceptable impacts, is in these big flat places where we allow camping to occur, in many cases unregulated, sort of willy-nilly camping. And so going to a more containment strategy that puts people on the most sustainable sites is absolutely the answer. Side hill campsites, again, if you have sloping terrain but no flat places, you go and create it. You literally use construction techniques that you apply to trails to do bench campsite. You do excavation, you do fill, you generally put rocks to support the fill, and you make these tiny little campsites, but you make perfect tent pads on them, and they get used, and people spatially concentrate all of that camping activity on a tiny, tiny campsite. Some areas we've studied, rugosity became real important, and that's just how rocky or rooty or how uneven is the terrain in these offsite adjacent areas. And rugosity came up as being significant in some areas where it was present. And then finally, grasses. Grasses, there's a reason we plant grasses on our football fields and our lawns. They are incredibly resistant to trampling. And when they are trampled, they're incredibly resilient. They recover very quickly, particularly when they're in bright sun. Grasses in shade don't do anywhere near as well, but grasses in sun, in mostly sunny conditions, are very resistant to traffic and very resilient. And so pushing camping into areas with more sun makes a lot of sense. The grasses can come in and protect the soil. So all of this stuff that I've just very, very quickly kind of winged through, in terms of the sustainable camping management, not the BAMF study. The BAMF study is not in this particular publication. This is a study report from the Appalachian Trail study. It's about the Appalachian Trail. And all of the best management practices for camping that we developed are in this particular management-oriented publication. And I note at the bottom here, you can just simply do a Google search on sustainable camping best management practices, and you'll find a location where you can download the PDF file. And it's, quite frankly, I think it's the most comprehensive publication on sustainable camping management in backcountry or wilderness settings. This does not cover campgrounds like car campgrounds in front country settings. And that's the end of my talk. I would just simply say happy trails and leave no trace when you're enjoying the out of doors. And Sam and I can now entertain some questions and hopefully some good discussion. So think about any of the stuff I've just reported here or that Sam has reported, and come at us with a few questions. Let's see if I can set it. I'll stop sharing this. And I've got the chat back so I can see that. So yeah, I see one question here already. Is it possible to send us the presentation? I can make it available either as a PowerPoint or I can turn it into a PDF. And the problem is, where to send that. Is there a way to post it somewhere on the World Trails Network site?
Yeah, what we can do, thank you, Jeff. First up from me is a huge thanks for your presentation. Some really interesting insights there and some great research, I think. I love the robustness of some of your data was great, even though the sample size, as you said, was quite small, but really, really great. Thank you. Yes, we can post that link. We'll post it on the Trails Talk link to this talk recording, and we can put a link there to that presentation if you're happy with that.
Okay. Yeah,
great. And I see we've got a hand up from Nathaniel. Nat, go ahead.
Hello, good to see you, Jeff.
Good to see you.
Uh, I had a question that's really not directly related to the research that you've shown us, which is really interesting and fascinating and very relevant to my work in New Hampshire. But it does relate, and that is the accessibility of huts based on income. So, one of the things that, we're concerned about in the United States is that recreation has been really linked to a certain socioeconomic group. It's usually upper income or upper, middle income people. And as we want to make the outdoors more accessible to a larger population, the cost of recreation is important. And in the White Mountains, for example, the huts that we have that are maintained by the Appalachian Mountain Club are very expensive. And so they're not as accessible to people. I had an experience a number of years ago in New Zealand where I spent time, going hut to hut. It was very inexpensive. I was able to purchase a pass for a number of weeks. So I know it's not necessarily that huts are more expensive, but it depends upon who is managing them, what the purpose of the hut is. Sometimes huts are part of a economic strategy or a business plan for an organization, and so that drives the costs up. So I'm just wondering if we are to follow or pursue a strategy where we increase the number of huts to reduce the impact, to allow more people to have access to the backcountry. How can we at the same time address that issue of accessibility for people of lower incomes? How can we keep the prices down, basically?
Yeah,
I think that's a really important question. And my belief is that we really need to work hard to realize the goal that you're talking about, to make them affordable and accessible. And actually pointing to the 80% of the people in the United States, for example, who live in urban and suburban areas, they need access to nature. So one thing is the level of amenities. The White Mountain, Appalachian Mountain Club huts in the US are like European huts. They're full service. And so you pay for the fact that they provide you with meals and bedding. It raises the cost. Most hut systems in the US and certainly in New Zealand are self-service, where you bring your own food and cooking utensils. Actually, self-service they can provide cooking utensils and propane cookers, but that dramatically reduces the cost. The least expensive hut system in the United States is in the Mount Tahoma area, Mount Rainier. And Mount Tahoma Trails Association is a volunteer organization that runs a volunteer hut system. And there's another one, a volunteer hut system in Canada as well. And it's $15 per night to stay in the hut. And they're very well appointed with cooking facilities, but you bring your own food and sleeping bag. So there's a variety of design and amenity level issues that need to be addressed. And then the one other thing I would say is to keep huts affordable and to make sure that they are really contributing to conservation. I think that we will move towards situations where you can pay for your stay in the hut by doing hands-on conservation work. Invasive species eradication, habitat restoration, and so on. And I think we'll increasingly see huts, very simple huts that are movable, that will be moved around the backcountry to where work is needed. And people will come out from the cities and the urban areas. They have to be trained, they need certain skills, and they will actually do hands-on conservation work and stay in huts. It's kind of citizen science activity.
Yeah, let me add one more thing, Sam. When we were up there in Banff and Assiniboine, I'm pretty sure that the per person charge per night was $10 to camp in the campsites, whether it was a traditional site or one of these tent pad campsites. It was $10 per person. And then the other thing I'll add is that on the Appalachian Trail, we have hundreds and hundreds of these mostly three-sided shelters. And all of those, except for the ones in the White Mountains, which are bigger and have, all these services, all of these other shelters along the Appalachian Trail are completely free. They're built by the volunteer trail clubs. They're maintained by those volunteer trail clubs, but they're all free. And so they're kind of, I guess Sam was calling them an open, shelter, not really a hut. But that's free. And so some of these volunteer-led organizations could probably offer, hut systems at very low cost, I think. And so again, the research suggests that they're quite effective in minimizing the environmental impact.
Wonderful. We have one more question as well from Stephen. Stephen, go ahead if you can.
Yep.
Hi.
Hello all. Good to see you. Just a quick question. I'm curious about toilet facilities. You can talk in a lot of detail about that, and most appropriate based on volume, location, that sort of thing. I know the Appalachian Trail has done a fair bit of work on this, but if maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, again, you could do a Google search on Appalachian Trail sanitation manual, I think, and you'll find this publication. It's an excellent publication originally developed by the Green Mountain Club, where they looked at all of the different methods of human waste disposal in backcountry wilderness settings. And the silver bullet that's sort of in that publication are these above ground composting toilets. It's a bin system that is entirely above ground. And because of that, it's a more aerobic, high temperature decomposition of the human waste, and amazingly not smelly. It's, what's smelly is when you put human waste in a deep, dark hole in the ground where there's a lot of moisture, and it just sits there and doesn't really decompose. So these above ground decomposing toilets have been highly successful, except at locations at high elevations and places where it's really cold and wet. But in most places in the United States, other than deserts and high elevation areas, these toilets work exceptionally well. So I would look into those. The cat holing method that is promoted and marketed by the Leave No Trace program can also be effective. It's just that, in my experience, is when you have a highly concentrated area of use and people are using that method, there's some small percentage, we don't know how big it is it 5%, 10%, maybe 15% of people just simply don't do it. They don't do it well. They don't dig a hole, they don't bury their waste, it's surface disposed. And the managers essentially, when you get to that high level of use and that high level of people not doing the cat hole the way they're supposed to, that they basically say, oh, that's a failed method, it's not working. Well, it's probably only 5 or 10% of people that it's not working. It is a very effective method. You just got to educate and try to get everyone to use it, and then it can be effective. But when you get high use, you really need to start thinking about toilet facilities, not cat holing.
Right. And in huts in the United States, the two most common methods of human waste disposal are pit toilets and septic systems. And I think that might be a generalization around the world. There are more and more composting toilet systems that are coming in of various kinds, such as the one that Jeff mentioned. And it's a really important issue, but there's been a lot of work done, and that AT report is really terrific. The US is just started a hut alliance, a community of practice among hut owners, and they're working on a best management practice for human waste disposal in huts.
Yeah, once again, it's the Appalachian Trail Sanitation Manual. I think you should be able to find it if you do Google search with that. And it's free, it's a PDF.
Thanks, Jeff. Good
Great.
questions we've had all around. Just wondering if anyone else has any questions. We have come to the top of the hour, so essentially we're done with our talk time. Jeff, you did leave your email address at the end, and we'll happily share that if you're okay with that. If anyone has further questions, they can contact you. I think this has been super valuable and insightful as well as educational. So I'm super excited about small huts and these sloping hillside
campsites.
yeah, hillside camps. That just gives me a whole new way of looking at where I'm going to put my tent in future. So thank you so much for making time for this Trails Talk with World Trails Network. And same to you, Sam. Indeed, appreciate the last minute availability of both of you. And Jeff, good luck with your publication, and we look forward to it. And please share it with us once it is published in the literature, and we can share it with others. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Our pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.